Single mom loses her home in a fire. But a millionaire was in the crowd, and what he did left everyone in tears. Comment and rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The flames danced wildly against the darkened suburban sky, consuming everything that remained of a 30-year-old single mother's dreams. She held her 4-year-old daughter tightly against her chest, feeling the child's fragile body tremble as she watched their little house turn to ashes. 5 years of working double shifts as a waitress at the local diner, 5 years of hardship and sacrifice, all being devoured by the relentless fire that had started with a short circuit in the old wiring. The crowd of neighbors and onlookers gathered around, some offering words of comfort, others just watching the spectacle of someone else's tragedy. Among them, a 30-year-old man stood out with the understated elegance of his clothes and the expression of genuine concern that took over his face. The owner of a thriving restaurant chain, he had stopped there by chance, returning from a business meeting when he saw the orange glow cutting through the night. Something stirred deeply within him as he watched the woman. There was a desperate strength in the way she protected the girl, a fierce determination that reminded him of feelings he had buried 2 years before, when he lost his wife in an accident that forever changed his perception of the fragility of life. His stock investments and accumulated fortune seemed insignificant in the face of that scene of pure human vulnerability. Without hesitating, he approached, walking among the still, smoldering debris that was beginning to cool as the fire trucks arrived. The mother looked up when she noticed his presence, and he was struck by the intensity of her gaze, even through the tears she couldn't contain. "Excuse me for intruding," he said in a soft voice, crouching down to be at her level. "I have a big house with spare rooms. You can stay there until you get organized." "It's not charity, it's just what any decent person would do." She studied him for a few seconds, her eyes searching his face for signs of ulterior motives. She had learned to distrust male generosity, especially when it came from men who clearly had money. Her daughter's father had started exactly like that, with grand gestures and golden promises before disappearing when he found out she was pregnant. "Thank you," she replied, squeezing her daughter even tighter. "But we'll be okay. I already spoke to the social worker. She's taking us to a city shelter." He felt a pang of disappointment, but respected her refusal. There was something in the woman's posture that aroused immediate admiration in him. Even destroyed by the tragedy, she maintained her dignity like a protective shield. "If you change your mind," he insisted gently, taking a card from his pocket, "my name is here. Any time. Any day." She took the card more out of politeness than with the intention of using it, putting it in the pocket of her faded jeans. As he walked away, she quickly read the name printed on it and felt a shiver. She knew that name. He was the owner of the restaurant chain, where she had tried to get a job a few times, always being rejected for not having enough experience in higher-end establishments. 3 days passed in the city shelter before she got a job at a small diner downtown. The work was hard, the customers not always polite, but it was a fresh start. Her daughter stayed at the public daycare during the day, and at night they shared a tiny room with 2 other families in similar situations. It was in the 2nd week of work that he appeared. She was serving a table when she looked up and found him there, sitting alone near the window, watching her with that same thoughtful expression from that terrible night. Her heart skipped a beat, and she almost dropped the tray she was carrying. He ordered a simple meal and left a tip that was almost half her daily wage. When she tried to return it, arguing that it had been a mistake, he just smiled and said that good service deserved proper recognition. "Is your daughter doing okay?" he asked before leaving, and she was touched that he had remembered. From then on, he began to appear frequently, always polite, always asking about the girl, always leaving generous tips that she initially refused, but ended up accepting out of absolute necessity. There were nights when his tip paid for the milk and medicine the child needed, and she couldn't afford the luxury of pride when it came to her daughter's well-being. For 3 months, a silent dance developed between them. Glances that lingered longer than necessary, conversations about the menu that extended into discussions about literature, music, about life. She discovered that he was more intelligent and sensitive than she had imagined, and he found himself increasingly enchanted by the strength and sweetness she managed to maintain even in the face of difficulties. But it was when she discovered the truth that everything fell apart. The diner manager, in a casual conversation, mentioned that the establishment had recently been bought by the same restaurant chain as the card she still kept in her wallet. The extra hours she had earned, the small raise, all had been direct orders from the real owner. The humiliation burned in her chest like liquid fire. She had been turned into a charity case, a toy for the conscience of a rich man who probably didn't even remember how that situation had started. That night, when he showed up for his usual dinner, she served him with professional coldness, avoiding his eyes, answering his attempts at conversation with curt monosyllables. He noticed the change immediately, but she refused his attempts at private conversation, finishing her shift and leaving through the back door. He followed her to the parking lot, where the rain was beginning to fall in thick, cold drops. "What happened?" he asked, catching up to her near the bus stop. "Did I do something?" She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with anger and pain. The rain soaked her hair, sticking the strands to her face. But she didn't care. "You bought me," she said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "Bought me like I was an object, played with my dignity. Did you think I'd never find out you own this place?" The rain fell with increasing force over them, turning the parking lot into a melancholic setting where two wounded souls faced each other. He remained motionless for a few seconds, absorbing her words like physical blows. He had prepared many explanations for the moment when she found out the truth, but faced with the real pain stamped on that wet face, all the justification seemed empty. "It wasn't like that," he said finally, running a hand through his soaked hair. "I never wanted you to feel bought or humiliated." "Then how was it?" she retorted, crossing her arms over her chest in a defensive gesture. "You saw the poor little thing in the tragedy and decided to play savior, gave me a job out of pity, raised my salary to feel better about yourself." He took a step forward, but she recoiled instinctively, maintaining the distance between them. Her automatic rejection reminded him of how he had felt in the first months after losing his wife, when any attempt at human closeness seemed impossible to bear. "When I saw you that night," he began, his voice lower, forcing her to concentrate to hear him over the sound of the rain, "something woke up in me. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. I recognized in you a strength that I had forgotten existed." "Recognition?" She laughed bitterly. "What recognition can exist between the two of us? You with your fortune in stocks and investments, me picking up the pieces of my life?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if her words had touched on something deep and painful. When he opened them again, there was a vulnerability there that she hadn't seen before. "2 years ago, I was driving in the rain, exactly like tonight," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "My wife was in the passenger seat. We were coming back from a doctor's appointment. She was 3 months pregnant." His tone changed completely, and she felt her anger begin to falter, replaced by a painful curiosity. "A truck lost control on the wet road," he continued, looking at his own hands. "She died instantly. The baby, too. Since then, I've closed myself off in my business, in my money, because it was easier than feeling." The revelation hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had imagined many motivations for his actions, but never a loss as devastating as her own daily struggle for survival. "Until that night of the fire," he continued, raising his eyes to meet hers. When I saw you protecting your daughter with so much strength, so much determination, something that was dead in me started breathing again. It wasn't pity I felt. It was admiration. It was hope." She remained silent, processing his words as the rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of isolation from the rest of the world. "The job was real," he said. "I bought this diner 3 days after the fire, yes, but not to give you a job out of charity. I bought it because I found out you had tried to work here before and were rejected. I wanted to give you the opportunity you deserved." "And the overtime?" "The raise?" she asked, still suspicious, but with less aggression in her voice. "You work harder and better than any employee I've ever had," he replied with absolute sincerity. "I get here 2 hours before you show up. I watch how you treat each customer, how you never complain even when they're rude, how you always find a way to make people smile." She felt her defenses begin to crumble, but she fought to keep them up. She had learned the hard way that men knew exactly what women wanted to hear. "And the absurd tips? Do I deserve that too?" she questioned, trying to keep the hardness in her voice. For a moment, he seemed almost ashamed, lowering his gaze before answering. "The tips are pure selfishness," he admitted. "Every time you accept them, every time I see that you can buy something for your daughter, or pay for medicine, or have a better meal, it's like I can breathe a little better too." The brutal honesty of the response completely disarmed her. She had expected denials, elaborate justifications, anything but that raw and vulnerable confession. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" she asked, her anger giving way to deep confusion. "Because you would have refused everything," he said simply. "And I needed you to stay around. I know it's selfish. I know I don't have that right, but these 3 months have been the only ones in which I've been able to sleep without nightmares since I lost my family." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the rain hitting the asphalt. She looked at him, really looked, seeing beyond the heartthrob appearance and the aura of wealth. She saw a broken man trying to rebuild himself, just like she did every day. "Your daughter," he said after a while. "How is she? She seemed to have a cold last week." The simple question, the genuine concern in his voice, was what finally broke down her last defenses. Because here was a man who remembered details about a child he barely knew, who asked about her every time they met. "She's fine," she replied more softly. "The syrup I bought with your tip helped a lot." They stood there in the rain, 2 survivors of different tragedies, recognizing for the first time each other's pain. She realized that her anger had turned into something more complex, a mixture of understanding and fear of what it might mean to let that man truly into her life. "I need to go," she said finally. "The babysitter charges extra after 10. He nodded, respecting her need to process everything that had been said, but as she began to walk away, he called out to her one last time. "Just tell me one thing," he asked. "Is there any possibility that you can ever forgive me? Not for what I did, but for what I didn't have the courage to say before." She stopped but didn't turn to look at him. "I don't know," she said sincerely. "I need to think." He watched her walk away in the rain, disappearing into the darkness of the night. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt something like hope mixed with the fear of having lost the only person who had managed to make him feel alive again. The next day, she didn't show up for work, nor the next. On the 3rd day, he learned through the manager that she had requested a few days off for personal reasons. Her absence left him restless in a way he hadn't expected, as if the air in the diner had become heavier, less luminous. It was then that he received the call that would change everything. The call came at 6 in the morning on a grey Thursday. The voice on the other end of the line was tense, full of urgency that made him sit up in bed immediately, fully awake despite the hour. "Sir, it's about the employee you always ask about," said the diner manager hesitantly. "The single mom. She called a little while ago crying a lot. Her daughter is in the hospital." He didn't need to hear anything else. 15 minutes later, he was driving through the still empty streets of the city, his heart beating erratically as he tried to locate which hospital it could be. He called 3 units before finding the right one, and when he finally arrived at the children's emergency room, he found her sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway, her face in her hands. She was wearing the same clothes as 3 days ago, wrinkled and stained, her hair disheveled as if she hadn't slept. When she saw him approaching, her eyes widened in surprise and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to compose herself, quickly wiping away the tears she couldn't contain. "I heard your daughter was sick," he said simply, sitting in the chair next to her without asking permission. "How is she?" The simple and direct question broke down the last barriers she was trying to maintain. The tears returned in full force, and she recounted between sobs how the girl had woken up with a high fever and difficulty breathing, how she had run with her in her arms to the nearest hospital, how the doctors were talking about a serious lung infection that could become complicated. "They said she needs to be hospitalized for at least a week," she said, her voice breaking. "But I don't have the money to pay for a private hospital, and the waiting list for a room in the public one is huge. She could get worse waiting." He didn't say anything, just stood up and walked to the reception desk. She saw him talking in a low voice with the receptionist, showing some documents, making some calls. Half an hour later, a nurse came to get her with a reassuring smile. "The girl will be transferred to a private room in the pediatric ward," the nurse informed her. "The private health insurance has already approved all the procedures." She looked at him, confused and grateful at the same time, but he just shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "My company has a very good health plan," he lied softly. "It includes dependents of employees." She knew it was a lie, knew he had paid for everything out of his own pocket, but at that moment she didn't have the strength for pride or arguments. Her daughter needed care, and he had made it possible. What she didn't expect was that he would stay. During the first 48 hours, while the girl fought against the high fever, he practically didn't leave the hospital. He slept in the uncomfortable armchair next to the bed, took turns with her on night watches, and talked to the doctors to understand every detail of the treatment. It was on the 3rd night that she really began to see him. The girl had finally managed to get a more peaceful sleep after a difficult day of tests and medications. The room was plunged into dimness, illuminated only by the soft light of the medical equipment and the light coming from the hallway. She woke up to a strange sound and saw that he was humming softly a lullaby she didn't recognize. His voice was soft, almost whispered, and there was a deep melancholy in it that touched something in her chest. "What song is that?" she asked in a low voice so as not to wake the child. He stopped singing, seeming almost embarrassed to have been caught in that moment of vulnerability. "It was one that my wife used to sing," he said after a pause. "She said she would sing it to our son when he was born. After I lost them, I couldn't sing it again until now." The confession hit her deeply. Here was a man who had kept a lullaby for 2 years, unable to sing it until he found a sick child to whom he could offer it. "Continue," she said softly. "She seems to like it." And he continued, singing softly through the hours of the dawn, while she watched him with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she didn't dare name. For the first time, she was able to see him not as the millionaire who controlled her job, but as a broken man who was trying to heal himself by helping to heal her daughter. The days followed each other in a strange and intimate routine. He brought her breakfast, made sure she ate even when she said she wasn't hungry, talked to the girl when she was awake, telling funny stories about his restaurants that made the child laugh, despite the illness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one afternoon, when the girl was sleeping and they were alone in the room. "Because when my wife was in the hospital after the accident, I was alone," he said, looking out the window at the city below. "No one stayed with me during those endless hours. No one held my hand when the doctors gave bad news. And I swore that if one day I could prevent someone from going through that loneliness, I would." "But you barely know us," she said. "Why care so much?" He turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Because you too have made me remember that I'm still alive," he said simply. It was that afternoon that the girl had a relapse. The fever returned with force, accompanied by seizures that scared everyone. The doctors rushed into the room. She was pushed into the hallway while the medical team worked, and for the first time since it all began, she went into real panic. He found her in the hallway, trembling and crying, completely out of control. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, letting her collapse against his chest as she sobbed desperately. "She's all I have," she said through tears. "If I lose her, I won't survive." "You won't lose her," he said with a conviction that surprised her. "She's strong like her mother. She'll be okay." They stayed embraced in the hallway for what seemed like forever, until a doctor came out of the room with a reassuring smile. The crisis had passed. The girl was stable again. That night, something changed between them. She stopped fighting his closeness, stopped questioning his motives. When he fell asleep in the armchair, after practically not sleeping for 3 days, she took a blanket and covered him gently, allowing herself for a few seconds just to watch him sleeping. It was then that she realized that she had fallen in love with him, completely and irrevocably, despite all the reasons why she should protect herself. And that realization terrified her more than any illness of her daughter, because it meant that now she had much more to lose. The next morning, when the girl was finally discharged from the hospital, she knew that she would have to make a decision that would change their lives forever. He offered to take them home, but when they arrived at the small apartment she had rented after leaving the shelter, she turned to him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling with nervousness and determination. The words caught in her throat for a moment that seemed eternal. He watched her with expectation mixed with apprehension, as if he knew that what was to follow could change everything between them. The girl was playing on the floor with some toys that he had brought from the hospital, oblivious to the tension that hung in the small air of the room. "I've fallen in love with you," she said finally, the words coming out in an almost inaudible whisper. "And it terrifies me because I know you'll leave when you get tired of playing family." The confession hit him like lightning. He had imagined many things she might say, but not that raw and desperate statement that exposed all the vulnerability she had been trying to hide for weeks. "Why do you think I'll leave?" he asked, taking a step towards her. "Because that's exactly what her father did," she replied, looking at the daughter who was playing unaware of the adults' conversation. "At first it was beautiful. He promised me the world, said he loved me, that we would be a family. When he found out I was pregnant, he disappeared overnight. He left a note saying he wasn't ready for responsibilities." He felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the man who had hurt so deeply that extraordinary woman who was now trembling before him. "I'm not him," he said firmly. "How can I be sure?" she retorted, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "You have a fortune. You can have any woman you want. Why would you stay with me, with a single mom, with no money, no education, nothing to offer besides problems?" The question revealed a wound so deep that he understood that any wrong word could destroy any chance they had. He moved closer, reaching out to touch her face, but she recoiled instinctively. "Can I show you why I would stay?" he asked softly. "How?" Instead of answering with words, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and made a quick call. She heard him talking to someone about preparing some documents for signing the next day. When he hung up, he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Tomorrow, I'm going to sign the transfer of 50% of my shares to an educational fund in your daughter's name," he said calmly. "Not as an attempt to buy you or control you, but because I want you to know that my commitment to you two is real and permanent." The revelation left her speechless. He was talking about giving up a substantial part of his fortune, of his investments carefully built over the years. "Have you gone crazy?" she managed to say finally. "You can't do that. You've barely known me for a few months." "I know enough," he said, finally managing to touch her face, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I know a woman who works 16 hours a day to give dignity to her daughter. I know someone who prefers to go hungry rather than accept help that she considers charity. I know a mother who slept 3 nights in a hospital chair without complaining once." Her defenses began to crumble before the absolute sincerity in his voice, but she still struggled to maintain the emotional protection she had built so carefully. "What if you change your mind?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What if one day you wake up and realize you can have an easier life without us?" "Then you keep the shares anyway," he said simply. "The fund is irrevocable. Even if I disappear tomorrow, your daughter will have guaranteed the future she deserves." The absurd generosity of the gesture left her even more terrified, because it meant that he was serious about everything. It wasn't manipulation or an attempt at control. It was a man literally putting his wealth where his heart was. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "Because for the first time in 2 years, when I wake up in the morning, I have a reason to get out of bed," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Because when your daughter smiles at me, I feel like maybe I can be a father one day. Because when you look at me, I don't see pity for the rich widower. I see a woman who can see me as a man." His words broke the last resistance she could maintain. Unable to control herself any longer, she threw herself into his arms, finally allowing him to embrace her completely. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, feeling her tears wet his shirt. "I'm so scared," she confessed against his chest. "Me too," he admitted, kissing the top of her head, "but for the first time it's a fear worth feeling." They stayed embraced for long minutes, until the girl came over and pulled on his pants, asking for attention. He crouched down to talk to her, and the scene of seeing him interacting with her daughter with so much affection made her heart expand even more. 2 weeks passed in a new and strange routine. He started having dinner with them a few times a week, always bringing ingredients to cook together, turning the small apartment into a temporary home full of laughter and conversation. The girl got used to his presence, and he seemed to melt every time she called him by his name. It was on a Friday night, after they put the child to sleep, that the sexual tension that had been growing between them finally reached its limit. They were doing the dishes together when she turned around and found him looking at her with an intensity that made her whole body awaken. "If we get together today," she said, her voice hoarse with desire and nervousness, "there's no turning back. For me, it's not just physical attraction. It's complete surrender." "That's exactly what I want," he replied, moving closer until there was no more space between them. "Complete surrender. Yours and mine." When he kissed her finally, after months of accumulated tension, it was as if the whole world rearranged itself around them. The kiss was urgent, desperate, charged with all the emotion they had repressed for so long. She surrendered completely, allowing him to carry her to the bedroom, where they made love with a passion that surprised them both with its intensity. Afterwards, lying together in the darkness, she traced the contours of his chest with her fingers, still trying to believe that this was real. "And now?" she asked. "Now, you and your daughter move into my house," he said without hesitation. "And we start our real life, just like that without further ado." "Just like that without further ado," he confirmed, kissing her forehead. "Unless you prefer me to move in here. This apartment is a bit cramped for 3 people, but if that's what you want." She laughed, the first truly happy laugh he had heard from her. "Your house is better," she admitted. "It has a garden where she can play." "It does," he agreed. "And it has a room that can be just hers, painted the color she chooses." The simple promise of a room of her own for her daughter, something she had never been able to offer, touched her deeply. Here was a man who not only accepted her with her baggage, but embraced that baggage as if it were a gift. 6 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony in the garden of the house that was now theirs. The girl, radiant in a pink dress that he had chosen especially for her, carried the rings to the improvised altar set up under a tree that he had planted when they learned she was pregnant again. The discovery of the second pregnancy had happened 3 months after they moved into his house. She had been terrified, fearing that the responsibility of another child would make him rethink the whole situation. But when she told him, he lifted her into his arms and spun her around the room, laughing with pure happiness. "Our family is growing," he had said, his hands already caressing her still flat belly. Now, watching him exchange rings with her, while her daughter applauded and the baby moved in her belly, she finally believed that happy endings were possible, even after the greatest tragedies. When they kissed to seal the marriage, she whispered in his ear, "Thank you for not giving up on us." "Thank you for letting me stay," he replied, holding her as if he would never let her go. And so, under the golden afternoon sun and surrounded by the scent of the flowers he had planted for her, two souls wounded by life found in their mutual surrender the healing they sought, proving that sometimes true love is born from the ashes of the greatest pain, stronger and more beautiful, for, having survived the storm, he had fulfilled every promise, every gesture of commitment, transforming from a generous stranger into the love of her life and the father her daughter always deserved to have.